Good morning on this Monday, October 26th, the first working day, 75 years after the United Nations was born based on the charter here in San Francisco. I'm Benedict Wexler, the Consulate General of Switzerland, and I would like to thank you all for joining this talk. 75 years ago, the world committed itself to working together and rebuild continents from torn apart by a world war. The UN's main goal was to prevent conflicts of this scale by collaborating to advance the well-being of all people. Over 3/4 of a century later, we can say, main mission accomplished. Much progress has been achieved, but so much remains to be done. Today, the UN and the broader multilateral architecture of collaboration is challenged. How to protect, fix, and develop it further? This is what we will talk about today with our distinguished guest, Brad Smith, at this third Geneva talk. So in this spirit, welcome to the residence of the Swiss Consulate General in San Francisco, right above China Beach. You saw the pictures probably when you were early enough to join this talk in the introduction. And Joya, isn't it peculiar that Switzerland, as a landlocked country, has 2 locations right on the water?
Indeed, Benedict. Hello, good morning. I'm Joya. I'm the CEO of Swissnex, which is the innovation outpost of Switzerland here in San Francisco. And yes, indeed, we actually share a gorgeous location together at Pier 17, right above the water. And it is a space that we have established as a little bit of a mini Switzerland, a neutral place to convene myriad actors from science, from technology, from policymaking, to engage in some of the conversations around the most pressing issues that we face at the intersection of technology and humanity.
We're both very thrilled and excited to welcome Brad Smith to this conversation. Hi, Brad.
Hello, great to be here.
Though we are so sad to have you not here in person, we're proud to make you feel almost at my home, thanks to the latest Swiss video conferencing tools.
We don't need a mute button. Nice.
I won't name the company, but I think we'll get some mentioning and credits at the end.
Okay.
We don't need a mute button, I think, for our conversation, but in the unlikely case, we have this Swiss soft disciplinary tool which will interrupt you. Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, doesn't need a long introduction, and it would probably fill the whole time at our disposal to do it properly. You have been described as a de facto ambassador for the technology industry at large, and one of the technology industry's most respected figures. You are the author of the book, Tools and Weapons. And I must say, it's such a good, enlightening read. And please, though you describe writing a book like embarking on an Iliad, I truly hope that more will follow. And I don't say that just out of a diplomatic courtesy. But now, Brad, first, we want to know where you come from. Can you share with us a little bit where you were born and raised and what values are directing you in your daily life and work?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, in Wisconsin, and what I thought of as a big town, but from the perspective of places I lived since, was really a small one. Town called Appleton, Wisconsin, near Green Bay. But I was fortunate to go to college out on the East Coast, go to law school in New York, and I was extraordinarily fortunate early on to study in Switzerland. I spent a year studying at the Graduate Institute, or what's now called the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. That was during law school. So I've followed that later on by living and working for 4 years in London and 3 years in Paris before spending now almost 25 years here in the Seattle area.
Great. So, I mean, we can probably say you got a good dose of Geneva values and principles. And, I'm sad that Switzerland allowed such a brain drain for not keeping you already back then in Geneva. But okay, we're happy that you're still very fond of Geneva and Switzerland today. That was really very inspiring. Thank you. We would like to talk about multilateralism and governance, and it sounds always a bit abstract when you talk about that, but I think it's defining the rules, principles, values, and processes, like in a constitution, that allows nations and people to work together to solve problems on a global scale. And Geneva and Switzerland have been at the center of several successful initiatives, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, with the development of the humanitarian international law and its enforcement procedures. And something rarely known, the Clé de Berne, which in the 19th century solved an essential operational problem in the European railway connections. And then the International Labour Organization, ILO, bringing for the first time not only states, but also trade unions and employers association around the same table. And more recently, the creation of the Office of the High Commissioner for the Human Rights in Geneva. But others, we must admit, like the League of Nations, failed, but provided valuable lessons for future projects. And like the United Nations, the most successful and comprehensive multilateral governance system in history so far. But Brad, today, what do you think would the UN look like in your view if we were able to draft a San Francisco Charter 2.0 today?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think the first thing we should always think about is what are the problems that we need to solve? I think that the spirit of multilateralism was really born, as you point out, through a series of changes. I would go back actually to the 1860s when the nature of technology just made warfare, frankly, just, far more horrendous for combatants and non-combatants alike. And that's what gave birth to the International Committee of the Red Cross. And it was from a recognition that it was the type of problem that could not be solved by a single country or two countries working bilaterally. It really required a multilateral approach. World War II and its conclusion, I think rightly, brought the world to a recognition that it was just impossible to keep the peace unless the nations of the world were more united. I think that need remains. As you said, I think the UN has actually accomplished quite a bit, probably far more than most people in some countries would consider when they think about it. And I think it is that multilateralism. I think a UN that was created today would probably be focused on a broader set of challenges. It would certainly need to focus on military conflict and the preservation of peace. But if you think about 2020, we live in a time when, as ever, a pandemic is not just a reality, but a permanent risk. I think it's more permanent risk in a world where there is such global travel. We live in a world where perhaps the greatest challenge of the century is the climate. Carbon, like a virus, respects no border. So I think that a UN that is created today would be perhaps a bit broader than it was envisioned in 1945. I think it might be structured a bit differently to recognize the countries that are leaders in various fields. It might be structured to acknowledge the role of regional organizations like the European Union. But I also think that it might well have more that we already see in the UN today than something that's different, because there's a lot that the founders of the UN created in 1945 that I think are every bit as essential today as they were 75 years ago.
Great.
Thank you, Brad. You mentioned it very aptly. The United Nations Charter was drafted in one of the darkest hours, really, that humanity has gone through, right after the Second World War, just around the Second World War. And, today we continue facing, and you mentioned it also, lots of different types of challenges, from a digital divide and learning gaps across the world. You mentioned climate change, really some socioeconomic inequalities, etc. So today the multilateral system is really meant to address all of those. In your view, do we have the right venues today? Do we have the right people sitting around the table in order to address those challenges? And if not, who's missing? What do we need to fix here?
Well, I think we have the right venues, but we don't have enough of the right people sitting around the table. I think your question captures that very well. The world that was envisioned in 1945 was a world in which governments really were the defining actors on the global stage. Frankly, it was a smaller number of governments. There were obviously vastly fewer nations that were independent than exist today. But I think what has most changed in the 75 years since is the increasing role of non-state actors. And principally, we've seen two forms of non-state actors arise. We've seen NGOs play a prominent role. I think this is actually something that, again, was born in Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross. It really was the initial leader in this field. When you look at what brought the world together to adopt the Fourth Geneva Convention in the late 40s, the ICRC actually was at the center, and it's even given a role under the treaty. We've seen other NGOs follow in their footsteps. I think one of the most notable examples led to the treaty to ban landmines and the like. We've seen room for NGOs, I will say, around the edges of the room in United Nations meetings, and they're at least in the room. I think the other non-state actors that have become more important are from the private sector. There is a global business community today. Interestingly, you have a number of companies that in many ways are as global as the international institutions in the UN or otherwise, headquartered in Geneva. Certainly the tech sector represents that. A company like Microsoft has offices and employees in 110 countries around the world. And I would never advocate that companies be treated on the same plane as governments or sovereign states. I think we need to be subservient to governments and sovereign states. But I think that it is easier to solve the pressing problems of the day if we're in the room and we're part of the conversation. It is more of a multi-stakeholder world than we saw 75 years ago. And I think there's room for innovation when it comes to governance, at least in a way that more formally creates opportunities for different voices to be heard.
Thank you, Brad. I mean, that's, I think, also what you see happening now, that countries like Switzerland, Denmark, and others are really sort of developing a tech diplomacy, which is acknowledging this importance. And then you see at the same time that also companies are in a way developing their own diplomacy in a way, because they feel it's necessary to deal with these organizations and institutions that are setting the norms for their global markets. But I think what we feel, and I think that is the point where you see also that, companies couldn't rule the world alone, because when we see the world is also facing a crisis of trust, which affects values and systems of our modern democracies. We're faced with some fundamental security threats stemming from cyberspace. And in this spirit, Switzerland recently launched the Trust Valley Initiative in Geneva and continues to build up the Geneva Dialogue on responsible behavior in cyberspace. Now, you've been also active in that field, and your book also tells some really touching examples of it. How can we ensure that we build safe, sustainable digital infrastructures that inspire trust and protect the values dearest to us all? And what mechanisms or initiatives you think are missing today in order to get to that goal?
Well, I think there's several things that are moving forward, and frankly, we just need to keep pushing harder and faster on all of them. One is to harden technology defenses around the world, and here, tech companies have the initial role, and people can't deploy things unless we create it. But then people do indeed need to adopt them. Governments do to protect themselves. Companies, even individuals and families, we need to use the safeguards that are put in place. I do believe that we need to continue to add to the rules of the road. There are many international norms and even legal rules that we start with including the Fourth Geneva Convention and the United Nations Charter. But I think we need to fill those out, and there are some gaps that I would like to see us close, especially when it comes to norms that will ensure the protection of democracy and fundamental democratic processes, elections, and the like. I think we need to continue to, frankly, add to the family of international institutions, including NGOs. To me, one of the best steps of the last 18 months or so has been the creation of the Cyber Peace Institute. Microsoft is one of the institutions that helped stand it up. I thought it was important that it be based in Geneva, and I'm glad that it is, because I think it then connects with the ICRC, with the UN, with the other institutions that are there. Ultimately, I do think that the preservation of a cyber peace in any real form, will require that we recognize that we live in a world that sort of is between conventional peace and conventional war. We have this constant array of attacks, and I think it will require more collective defense, by countries. Not just to focus on governance and rules, but also on deterrence. And you're seeing increasing focus there too, and I think that's welcome.
Yeah, and you made a nice parallel in your book also about, the dual use character of technology. Like Einstein, he saw it with the nuclear power, which is, it can heal cancer, but, you can kill people and you can erase the planet. So I think that's certainly the path we have to go faster on that, in that direction.
Yes, I mean, maybe also latching onto that a little bit. So Microsoft in many ways has established itself as the trailblazer when it comes to really promoting cross-industry collaborations or multi-stakeholder collaboration to achieve some global progress around those key challenges. You mentioned the example of the Cyber Peace Institute that Microsoft helped to co-create. There's the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, where Microsoft also was one of the true promoters of that. And then the recently established United Nations Affairs Office, with Microsoft actually sending basically its own diplomat, so to say, to the United Nations in New York. I just have a question really to you personally, Brad. What is it that motivates you as the president of Microsoft to take this role as a trailblazer? And what do you think it will take for other companies to follow suit?
Well, I think, for me, it probably is the connection between two things. I think we have an opportunity and a responsibility to try to contribute to real solutions on the great problems of our day. We're in a position where I do believe that we can have, some impact if we really focus. And problems like, climate and sustainability or cyber peace, or COVID-19, for example, are really good examples of where we can and hence should do more. Second, I probably am a product of my own experience. I think we all are. I do believe I took away, from my education when I was an undergraduate at Princeton University. I wrote my senior thesis on international refugee law and the role of the UNHCR. The first time I ever took an international trip was to come to Switzerland. I got a scholarship to go do research for that in Geneva. And then, of course, I studied there. And so I got more exposure than I'll just say at least most younger Americans to the role, not just of multilateralism, but the great institutions that make a difference, every day. And I think, organizations like UNHCR typify that. And so I've very much been motivated to see where we can continue to push forward. I have to say I'm extremely excited and passionate about our creation of a new UN Affairs team and office for Microsoft. We have people now in New York and Geneva. And I think it's right that we do this. I mean, we do a lot of work for the UN to provide technology to UNDP, to UNICEF, right now to WHO. But I think we can go beyond the providing of technology to use our voice to stand up for the values that I think we continue to need the UN to espouse. And in so doing, I actually do want to shine a spotlight. I hope people will say, wow, if Microsoft thinks that the UN is important enough that it should have a dedicated team to work with it, maybe others should be focusing more on what they can do to support the UN as well. I hope that this will become something that will become, just say, more common a decade from now. Right now, we're quite unusual in what we're doing, but I don't think we'll remain that way.
I love that, actually. And I mean, we can, maybe we have to send more tech CEOs to school at the Graduate Institute, which, by the way, is also my alma mater. I'm very happy to share that with you.
And, Brad, you said you're from Wisconsin. I think there are also some farmers out there. And, I think I was working several summers on a farm in the Alps, and I always saw, a good farmer, he knows what sustainability is. Because a good farmer never overexploits his resources, his soil, because then he knows the next generation wouldn't have anything to farm on. And I think that's also something that guides us. And coming a little bit again back to Geneva, with the digital convention, you made a sort of a wake-up call also for, I think, us Swiss and people in Geneva. Hey, we have to do more with that whole world in Geneva. And I think there's been some interesting initiatives recently. Again, the SDG Lab, for instance, at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva is such an initiative. And now recently, Switzerland launched the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. And that's also something very dear to us. That's our core mission, that we can turn cutting edge science and technology advances into innovative solutions and diplomatic tools for the world's most pressing needs. Now, in your opinion, what would it take that the technology firms engage also more in Geneva in international organizations like you've done?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head in part of this. I think that there is such an important opportunity to increase collaboration between, I'll just say, Switzerland, and for this purpose, let's just call it the West Coast of the United States, although there's certainly many other parts of the US where this is important as well. I think that part of it should continue to be grounded in science and technology. I've really developed a much greater familiarity with the importance of what's happening at ETH and EPFL. We at Microsoft work with researchers at both institutions. And one of the things that we've strived to do is connect not just as a company, but to forge broader connections between both of these great universities and their counterparts on the West Coast. At the University of Washington, where I've tended to play a role to bring them together, but also obviously at places like Stanford and Berkeley and on farther down the West Coast. I think there's an opportunity to connect between these universities and the Graduate Institute, and then the tech sector on not just the science and the engineering, but the issues that science and engineering are creating for the world. And this is where you really go to the rest of the liberal arts, especially these issues of international relations and governance and political science that we're talking about today. So I think that there's a huge opportunity to forge these stronger connections, in ways that will be, frankly, not just good for Switzerland and the West Coast of the United States, but I think more importantly, good for the world, because I think together we can push forward on some of the innovations, scientific innovations, non-scientific innovations that will address some of the world's pressing problems.
Thank you. And, you mentioned already the Cyber Peace Institute with its president. She's at Stanford, also at the Human Artificial Intelligence Institute. And we have with the World Economic Forum, Mark Benioff from Salesforce here in San Francisco, who's also a great contributor to the discussions there. So I think that marriage or partnership between Geneva and San Francisco has a really big potential, Joya?
Yes, absolutely. And maybe that can be our closing question today. So we really believe that this healthy marriage between the power of the innovation system of the US West Coast and the tech companies here with the values of international Geneva or Switzerland more broadly is really very key for us to address the global challenges we currently face with both the right technology, the right innovation, the right mindset, as well as with an eye on the protection of the most vulnerable people actually, and really safeguarding our values. So what is your advice to us? Because what's something that we are really trying to do here is to bring those two worlds together, to create that bridge between international Geneva and the US West Coast. What is your advice to us? How can we do that successfully? How can we translate between those worlds to create sort of synergetic cooperation?
Well, I would offer two thoughts. I mean, first, I think that the West Coast of the United States has been one of the regions in the world that in recent decades, has been a real leader globally in innovation, in technology and engineering in particular. It gave birth to a very broad sort of startup mentality. Venture capital was largely invented on the West Coast of the United States in Northern California. But the impact of technology today is so broad. It's so deep in societies that this is a moment in time when we really have to ask ourselves, what are the values that we want innovation to serve? And when we think about the answer to that question, I personally think that one of the best places to search for the answer is in Switzerland. It is in Geneva. There is what I will call the spirit of Geneva. And I think the spirit of Geneva is grounded in recognition of the importance of fundamental human rights and the democratic principles that, of course, were born in Western Europe and then made their way, into the great, post-World War II human rights instruments, and they continue to define, I think, the important values, certainly for the 76 democratic nations of the world. I think the spirit of Geneva is fundamentally about recognizing that there are problems that can only be solved if governments set aside their differences and they agree to work together. And I think the spirit of Geneva recognizes that technology is wonderful, but there need to be guardrails put upon it. I mean, that really was the essence of the first Geneva Convention going back to the 1860s. That military powers, governments would collectively commit to exercise self-restraint and recognize a higher law, if you will. So I think the world needs to think about and listen to that spirit today. And I think if we can bring together technology with these values, we'll create the foundation for much faster progress in, frankly, every issue that is on people's minds today. So as you can tell, I'm a great believer in what we can do if we work more closely together.
Well, Brad, thank you so much. I mean, that's the best way to start a working week. Could we do that every Monday morning at 8? That would be so great.
I will have to come out and see you in your beautiful view.
And I didn't have to use this, it's fantastic.
No, Brad, thank you so much. This went by extremely fast. We really thank you for sharing your thoughts and for more than anything, the work that you do with Microsoft, with your team to really support this bridge actually and really translating between those worlds and bringing those worlds together in the interest of all of our planet, actually humanity and the things that we care about. So really appreciate your work. Thank you to you. Thank you to your team for putting on this event. Thank you to the Swissnex team as well. And thank you to Logitech, a little intro here as well, for supporting us on the technology side in this this morning's conversation, the third actually Geneva Talks with more to follow. We look forward to that.
Merci beaucoup pour l'État et la République de Genève.
Exactement. Thank you so much.
Les meilleures salutations. They have already, their working day is already over. We started.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you,
Have a great
Brad.
day. Good
Have
week.
a good week. Take
Bye,
care.
Brad. Thank you.
Bye.